Kia ora te whānau. Being on Zoom this morning means that those at church get the weird experience of seeing me operating the sound desk and speaking on the screen at the same time. I'm sorry about that. Today is the first Sunday of the year. Looking back at last year, I'm sure you can easily draw up a list of good events and joyful times, and a parallel list of bad things or hard times. Sometimes the challenging times can be particularly negative. We can even feel that we are targeted. And yes, at times you don't need to be experiencing medical depression to feel this. So how are you looking towards this new year? What do you anticipate? What will be in your good list? And what will you put in your bad one? What do you really hope for? Joy? Now, Julie has given me a particularly meaty passage in the letter from James to teach from, and I will try and keep it as simple as possible. Hopefully, you'll go back and revisit the passage and see how all the bits tie in. One of the things that you'll find is that a lot of what James says echoes other parts of the Bible. So let's have a read of James chapter 1, 2 to 18. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you'll be perfect and complete, needing nothing. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they're unstable in everything they do. Believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them. But those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like a little flower in the field. The hot sun rises and the grass withers. The little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all of their achievements. God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterwards, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you're being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word. And we, out of all creation, became his prized possession. As we begin this series on the letter of James, we find he spends little time greeting people. His message is to all Christians. Instead, he jumps straight in to tell us that when trouble comes your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. It's not if troubles come your way or trials come your way, it's when. And it's not circumstances you or I could have predicted, but when we find ourselves in the midst of it all. It's not something we could plan to avoid. You keen to consider that joy? Well, I don't think he's saying that we need to feel elated when we face the challenges in life. But he wants you and I to see that drawing on God's wisdom and perspective and working through the trial can mean that we can look back at the event with hindsight and put it in the good things list because God has helped you grow. For those of you who remember joy as a fruit of God's Spirit, there's a learning curve to discover that the fruits of the Spirit don't come at no cost. Like the plums on a tree in my garden, fruit of the Spirit is often born through our lives as God works through and on us through the challenges we face. One of the teachers who worked with my parents when I was younger developed a brain tumor that would eventually take his life. But the thing that stood out in my memory of this man, even today, was the fact that he praised God for his cancer, as it was only through his diagnosis of cancer that he learnt to trust and love the Lord. Now, one of the big things about James is that he doesn't go back and re-stress that we are saved by God's grace and that alone. Instead, James notes that it's not cheap grace. Some people I know and love have chosen as they face a trial to say, God didn't give me what I want, so why should I work with him? Why should I trust him? Having a focus with Jesus is not built on getting everything we want. It's built on our focus of God. Rather than looking at life with us as boss, as KFC tends to promote, we need to learn to honor Jesus's ownership and allow God's Spirit to transform us and the way we look at things. Our faith has to grow through the circumstances we find ourselves in. So what should we do then when we face a challenging time? James recommends that we ask our generous God for his wisdom and his perspective. We're not particularly good at this, sometimes because we feel we might not like what he would show us. We know that asking God for his guidance, we have to be eager to follow it. A double-minded person is one who would rather be making the decision for themselves than listening to God. So what's my experience of this? One of the big lessons I've had to learn is to start with God's focus in mind and to ask for what I understand his perspective to be. Our eyes need to be on Jesus, not on us and our circumstances. Yes, sometimes I've seen God answer dramatically. And sometimes I have not been ready to receive his guidance. That was where I was at. Sometimes I have found his call is persevere through the circumstances, rather than this is the way out. Often I find that through the trial, God is building something even better than I thought was possible. So how are you going to ask God for wisdom to face this coming year? Are you going to ask with a willing and humble heart? I found the humility aspect is different for each of us. It's coloured by the degree we feel we can meet our own needs. When James talks about the poor being blessed, you may well think of Jesus's words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Okay. Those who really don't have much are less inclined to cling to their self-reliance than those who are wealthy. In New Zealand, even those of us who think we don't have a lot still have a tendency to want to do things our way. We have a society that expects to have its needs met. We expect the government to provide for us. It affects our stubbornness, our reluctance to change. It is easy to point at more wealthy people we know and see how their income and assets tend to affect how they expect everything to be provided for them. Sometimes we can even feel God needs to take them down a peg or two. But hang on, what about us? To what extent do you and I recognize our need for God and our need for humility? Jesus spoke about it as being key to inheriting the wealth of the kingdom of God and experiencing what God has created for us in this world. So as you and I face 2022 and the trials coming along the way, what part do you think humility will play in your relationship with God? And there's another angle that James makes us aware of in this rather meaty passage. Our attitude to God about challenges we face in trials and temptations. We have to be honest with ourselves as well as God. Blaming God is always the easy way out. And yes, he's big enough to hear out our frustrations. But the idea of blaming God doesn't really achieve anything. God is not the bad guy. Whatever is good and perfect comes down to us from the Father. When we face temptations, they can only have an influence on us because of our personal desires. Satan's fully aware of this. Tempting is not what God does, as it would work against his nature. In fact, he's very opposite. He looks at us and says, as in 1 Corinthians 10:13, God is faithful and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond your strength. And he provides a way out of that temptation. So, God knows and God is constant in his care. Asking for something from God, we know it should fit in with his character. And with what he's expressed is his will. You can't twist God into doing something which is not right. Prayer is not magic. It's humble communication with a God who loves us and gave Jesus to us, the Word. We are his prized treasure. When you have something special, do you not look after it? Facing this year, do you start it knowing that God regards you as precious? If you do you work to plan to work with him through the challenges you will face? How can you actively work at your relationship with him. You see, we don't have to wait for triumph to come. We can start drawing on his wisdom every day until it becomes like breathing. When facing temptations, will you recognize where they come from and look at God's path to get you out of them? God's saving grace is to be grown on into a priceless relationship with him. Will you discover joy in the trials you face? As you review this year, will you be able to look back and see that good things list rather full? Because you've chosen to draw on God's Spirit to face each day? I pray so. Let's just finish with prayer. Father, I pray that you help me and every one of our whānau walk together with you this day and this year. Help us to learn to trust you through the trials and draw on your strength. Amen.